Hi, I'm Jack Schmidling.
And I'm Marilyn Shank. Before you throw away those old newspapers, we'd like to show you how you can turn them into some really useful things and learn how much fun it can be to do your share to improve our environment.
We hear a lot about garbage dumps filling up and the need to recycle, but most of us just sit around and wait for the government or someone else to solve the problem. Well, we got tired of waiting for someone to do something and started doing a little experimenting on our own. One of the most amazing things we learned was how incredibly simple the paper recycling process really is. With a few simple tools, a bucket, an old spoon, a rolling pin, and a pile of old newspapers, you're in business. However, before we show you some of the things that we made, I'd like to point out that these are simply ideas to get you thinking about what you can make. And in addition to a learning experience, somewhere in all of this is possibly a business opportunity for someone with a little imagination. Before we get into the recycling process, let's talk a little bit about just what newspaper really is. This is Sunday's newspaper. I'm going to tear off a little piece, and we're going to take a look at it under the microscope. If we scratch away at a piece of paper, we find that it is made of millions of tiny fibers. These are wood fibers that come from the trees that are ground up to make paper. Saving trees is one of the major reasons we should all be interested in recycling paper. If we add a little water to our sample and scratch around some more, you will get a strong clue as to how the paper recycling process works. The water loosens up the fibers, allowing them to be used over and over again. recycling process starts with our old newspaper. We tear it into strips and put them into our bucket. You can actually use just about any kind of paper. In addition to newspaper, you can use old shopping bags, cardboard cartons, and office waste of all kinds. We find newspaper the easiest to work with because it falls apart so easily when wet. It is also readily available and convenient to collect and store. When the bucket is about halfway full, we add enough water to cover the paper completely and begin mixing it up with a spoon or stick. We should end up with about a half a bucket of paper and about 3/4 of a bucket full of water. In other words, the water should be a few inches from the top of the paper. It should look about like this and is now known as paper pulp. This we let sit overnight. The longer it sits, the easier the mixing will be. The next day we start mixing. The object is to turn the wet paper into the smoothest mixture we can. The more we mix, the more the paper is shredded back into the original fibers from which it was made. By poking and stirring, a reasonably homogeneous mass can be produced. One thing that will take a great deal of effort out of this is an electric drill. Get an aluminum rod from the hardware store and bend it into a simple hook. And when used in the drill, the job becomes a piece of cake. When sufficiently mixed, your pulp should look something like this. We will take this sample upstairs and examine it more closely under the microscope. We can now see that we have broken down the paper rather well. The fibers are separated and pliable. This pulp is now ready to be turned into, once again, a paper product by reshaping it and removing the water. Our paper making process begins with a scoop of pulp in a strainer, and we'll let the water drain out for a few minutes. Okay, once it's fairly dry, put the bucket on the floor here. We're going to spread a towel, an old towel, on our work table here. Smooth it out a little. And we blop our pulp down. Take the other end of the towel now and lay it on top of the blob and just press it. And lots of water is going to come out. And we keep doing this, moving the towel around to dry spots until we feel water, and we do it again. And we continue this process until we see no more water in the towel. Okay, once it's dry to the touch, take another clean towel, lay it on it, and pat it some more. And then take your rolling pin and start rolling it. And now the water will really start oozing out. And so again, keep moving the towel to a dry spot and continue rolling it. Depending upon how well you drained it, this can be a matter of a few minutes or seemingly forever. Rolling pin needs some oil on it. Okay, once it's fairly dry, then comes the tricky part, which requires a little finesse. We want to get the bottom side up, and we do that. Pull it back in the middle, and then we peel off the wet bottom side and put our other towel back on it and roll some more. We keep rolling until it's dry and thin. The more you roll, the drier it gets and the thinner it gets. So we're going to roll it and dry it a little bit more. And we'll check it, see if it's dry yet. Oh yeah, now we can lift it. At this point, you have a basic rough piece of paper. It's still wet and very fragile. The next thing we do is we lay it on a dry sheet of paper and start rolling it carefully. This establishes a nice smooth texture on the surface of the paper, and also gets rid of some more of the water. You want to do this on both sides. Turn it around and use the dry side and roll it some more. You notice all the humps and bumps left from the towel disappear and leave us with a very smooth textured surface. It starts to curl up around the edges, but that's okay. And turn it around, do it from both sides. You'll also notice the paper keeps getting thinner as it gets smoother. And while it gets thinner, of course, it gets larger. So this is where we establish the final dimensions of the paper, roughly, and also the final thickness. Don't overdo it because it's still very fragile and will tear easily. At this point, we can now dry the paper. One of the simplest ways to dry your paper is to simply place it on a cookie rack and let it dry in the air. When the paper is completely dry, it will curl up just like a potato chip. But that's okay because we're simply going to wet it a little bit with a sprayer. It softens it up again. And then we're going to roll it out on the table. But this time we're going to do it on the hard surface of the table. And in that way, we'll improve the finish even more. Once you're satisfied with the finish and the thickness, the next project is to trim it to size. And we're going to use a paper cutter here. And we're going to trim this one to postcard size. We now have a 4x5 postcard. The last step is a final drying and pressing in a telephone directory. And we'll just set a weight on top of it. Well, we've now shown you the basic paper making process. By controlling the amount of pulp and the pressure of the rolling pin, you can make very large paper, or you can make very thick paper, which actually more like a board. And we'll show you what you can do with some of these things later. A minor problem with our homemade paper is that upon close inspection, you will notice a few remnants of last week's news. A letter or a word here and there, or a bit of color from the front page banner. There are several ways of eliminating these if they are deemed to be objectionable. The most basic is to just keep mixing until they go away and pick out any that are left during the rolling process. But the easiest is to just run the pulp through a kitchen blender for a few minutes. In addition to eliminating unwanted news, it will produce a much smoother texture to the surface of the paper. The card on the left was made from blended pulp, and the one on the right was just mixed in the bucket. You will also notice that all the paper produced in this way has a uniform gray color. This is a result of the ink being mixed into the white paper and the pulp. Removing the ink requires chemicals and bleach, which not only are damaging to the environment, but totally unnecessary for most paper products. Now that you know how to make postcards, Marilyn is going to show you how to turn them into personalized greeting cards. With a few colored pencils, you too can show that you care enough to send the very best. And all it will cost you is a little time and the price of a stamp. The one side is a birthday greeting to her mom. And the other side has the address, postage stamp, and we use a rubber stamp that says recycled paper, so our friends know that we really care. Now it is time to move beyond simple paper making and show you how to make a number of useful and decorative items. Most of the techniques can be learned by watching Marilyn make a snowman.
To make the snowman requires forming the pulp into balls. But as you will notice, it tends to fall apart and not behave very well. The problem is solved by adding a cup of flour to the pulp. When this is mixed in, it becomes a glue that holds it together very nicely. After the flour is mixed in, scoop out some pulp with a strainer. Let it drain a bit. Then press out the remaining moisture with your fingers. The next step is to form it into balls. You do this by gently pressing it together and giving it a little squeeze. As you see, there's still some excess moisture in it. Kind of roll it around in the palm of your hand to get a nice shape on it. Now for the snowman, we need 3 balls of different sizes. Small for the head, medium for the main part of the body, and large for the bottom. When the ball is finished, nice and round and smooth, set it aside to dry thoroughly for painting. Here's the process we came up with for painting the balls. Go to your hardware store and buy some plain iron wire. or any wire you happen to have hanging around the house will do. Cut off about a 4-inch piece and bend one end into a hook. And find your ball and insert the end that doesn't have a hook on it into the ball with a twisting and turning motion, and make sure it's in there securely. Okay, now we're going to dip it into our bucket of paint. Let your ball drip a little while over the paint bucket. And then hang it up to dry. Make sure you put plenty of old newspapers underneath because it'll drip quite a bit. Do the same to all 3 of them. Because the paper is very absorbent, you might want to give them a second coat for a nice, shiny, glossy finish.
When the paint is dry, assemble the balls by inserting toothpicks into the holes left by the hanger. Next, we add a dab of glue and insert the other end of the toothpick into the next ball. And then do the same for the last ball. When the 3 balls are assembled, let them stand undisturbed until the glue dries. In case you're wondering why the snowman stands up at all, it is because we pressed a flat on the bottom of the large ball while it was drying. The last step is to give our snowman a face. We use colored push pins, but you could also use small bits of your paper pulp and color them when dry, or you could even draw the face on with a marking pen. And the final touch, our snowman gets a hat. For our next project, we're going to show you how to make the beverage can holder. We start out with a scoopful of the pulp, into which Marilyn has added the flour. Squeeze out as much of the water as possible. Then dump it onto a towel and proceed to form it around your beverage can. Continue to squeeze out the water while shaping the pulp. By the way, when you add the flour or any kind of glue to the pulp, it is then called paper mache. This is a French word for chewed paper. Then gently roll it on a towel to remove more water while pressing it into a smooth cylinder. We also need to form the bottom with our fingers and by pressing it gently on the towel. Make sure that the top is well below the edge of the can, or you will have a difficult time getting it out. When satisfied with how it looks, set it aside to dry. This may take a day or 2. Amazingly, when thoroughly dry, you can pull the can right out and have an environmentally sound, insulated beverage can holder. Take 2. You can paint them in the same manner as we painted the snowman, using hooked pieces of wire pushed through them. When the paint is dry, string them up using a sewing needle and a piece of string. This necklace used 44 balls of various sizes. Tie a knot, and you will have a hard time convincing friends that this necklace was once a newspaper. You can also make holiday ornaments with painted paper balls, the same way you would use styrofoam. But these are free and easy on the environment. Another fascinating use for old newspapers is to turn them into boards. You can saw them, nail them, and drill them, just like wood. The boards for this bookcase were made exactly like the postcards. They just used a lot more pulp. Well, now that we're all experts in paper recycling, we thought it would be interesting to see how it is done on a commercial scale. The folks at Chicago Paperboard Company invited us in to take a tour of their facility. As the sign says, they pay 50 cents per 100 pounds for old newspapers. This factory turns 6,000 tons of waste cardboard and old newspaper into huge rolls of new cardboard every month. Many of their larger suppliers bring the waste to them in bales. If not, the first step is to bale it for easier storage and handling. The bales are carried by forklift trucks to the pulping machine. After loading at the front end, they are pushed into the pulping machine as required. Except for the size, this machine is really not very different from our mixer. From the pulper it is pumped through pipes under the floor to the paper machine. This machine is known as a cylinder paperboard machine and is about as long as a football field. It contains a series of rollers, drums, and a continuous cloth belt called a felt. This felt is coated with pulp in multiple layers to form the new paper. The bottom drum is a cylinder of material similar to a window screen. As it turns through the pulp, it lifts a thin layer and presses it against the bottom of the felt, which here is seen traveling to the right. This machine has 8 such drums to achieve the final thickness. The rest of the machine simply removes the excess water by squeezing the paper-coated felt between steam-heated rollers. After passing up and overhead, the belt is now headed the other way, and at this point the paper is dry enough to be separated from the felt. One last squeeze through the steam-heated rollers gives the paper the proper size and finish, and removes the last traces of moisture. When completely dry, the paper is rolled up on a huge roll, 10 feet long and weighing about 5 tons. This particular machine is making cardboard about a millimeter thick. Here in the Quality Control Lab, the paper is monitored for thickness, finish, moisture, strength, and many other characteristics to assure a high-quality product. Our last stop is a conference room where some of the products made by customers of Chicago Paperboard are on display. These boxes are made by laminating a glossy printed sheet onto the brown cardboard. Next time you open a box, look inside. If it is brown, it is probably made from recycled paper. We save paper making for last because it is a little more complicated and requires some items you won't find in the kitchen. First of all, you will need to make a framed screen from wood and window screen. This screen should be about 1 inch larger in both dimensions than the paper you intend to make. You will need to make patches of material cut from anything convenient. These are from an old pair of khaki pants. They should be cut to just fit the inside width of the frame, but long enough to hang over the ends a little bit. The purpose of these is exactly the same as the continuous felt in the paper factory, but we will make one sheet at a time instead of a continuous piece. You will also need a large pan, a few inches bigger than the screen, and about 3 inches deep. A small roller completes the equipment list. This can be obtained at a photo supply store. Into the tray pour about 4 cups of pulp and enough water to cover the frame by several inches and mix it thoroughly. The amount of pulp controls the thickness of the paper, and you will have to determine this experimentally. You will also have to add about a cup of pulp each time a sheet of paper is made. You can also experiment with blending different kinds of scrap paper with the newspaper. We also find that adding cornstarch improves the finish substantially. But don't try to make soup. When it is right, it just looks like gray water. Slip the screen into the pulp, and while holding it on the bottom, mix the pulp around again. Then let the screen float to the top and gently lift it out and rest it on the edges of the tray to drain. Drain it again, then place the frame on a towel to draw out the water. Do this several times until the paper is no longer shiny with water. Lay the felt on the paper inside the frame with the long ends sticking out. Gently roll this against the paper. If you push too hard, you will leave screen marks on the paper. If you don't press hard enough, the paper will not adhere to the felt. The next step is to turn it over and wrap one end on the table while holding the felt at the other end. If you do it just right, it drops out without a wrinkle. A little practice will go a long way here. What you should end up with is a wet piece of paper on the felt, which is then left to dry. When dry, turn it over and peel off the felt, and your career as a paper maker has begun. At this point, you can iron the paper or simply use our old phone book trick. We, of course, turn our paper into flyers for this video. whether you take your paper to a professional or recycle it yourself. We hope that the next time you finish reading a newspaper, you do something else with it besides throw it in the garbage.